Hello everyone, today we talk about the 30 Years' War. Last summer I made a brief series about as a broader introduction, if you want, to the 30 Years' War. We look at arms, equipment, organization, manpower, tactics, strategy, various other issues concerning the 30 Years' War. Last spring, if I'm not wrong, I made, a bit about the Battle of Freiburg at the end of the same period of multiple wars, actually, that the 30 Years' War was a cluster of, practically. And I began, it's not really an ended series as such. I want to cover at least some of the major battles of the period. Hopefully next spring we will see that. But it's also important to talk more about 17th and also 16th century warfare a bit more in depth, and to start reasoning a bit on the work in progress that the historiography on the 30 Years' War actually is, when we get down to essentially at least the most consolidated topoi about especially the sort of progressive interpretation of the major military developments at this point in history. I used to follow part of the same insight. You know that I made multiple videos about the Dutch army of the 80 Years' War, Maurice of Nassau. Just recently we made yet another video about Gustavus Adolphus, Swedish infantry. We'll have to look at the various arms and also something more in depth. But there is some sort of more concrete aspect, especially about the largest armies of the time that were, as you know, essentially the imperial ones, the Catholic, Spanish, German, that were also actually undergoing some significant changes, and or, as we will see especially today, maintaining an important degree of military standard and effectiveness that has somehow been overshadowed by not much of course the important success in a national, in a moral sense, if you want, of the armies of Maurice of Nassau, the Gustavus Adolphus, the Protestant group, if you want. I was to use the term bloc, but it seemed too contemporary, even though it was really that. Of course, at least in the reaction, you can have that wall, right? Even though, again, there were Protestants that were sort of more flexible. The same goes for some Catholics, and we know that very well. But what I don't think pop culture has yet fully absorbed is what is being rediscovered a bit, or even discovered tout court, meaning that historiography never really made it out clear, right? That is the still substantial superiority of the Catholic military models that were out there. We're talking both about the Spanish and the Habsburgic imperials, right? And this goes in parallel with debunking that structuralistic mentality that wanted to tell you, after all, there was, again, if not a linear, but sort of a constant, remarkable progress. Think about the phraseology of the military revolution and all that revolved around that. This is sort of very positivistic, modernistic myth, if you want, something that could be just formulated in the 20th century with these tonalities, but that does actually have a very important and interesting historical root in the sort of affirmation in the historiographical research of the actual Protestant, and very effective and clever Protestant propaganda. I have nothing really against propaganda as such, right? Propaganda is actually a neutral term that is being hijacked with that sort of sinister concept that propaganda is as a made-up story, right? In many ways it could be, and in this case especially, we will see how that happened. I'm no expert actually in the history of the historiography, especially in the later centuries. It goes without saying that the rise to power of great nations like the Netherlands, United Provinces, England, Britain, but de facto the British Empire, Also Sweden, as far as the Swedish Empire was concerned, the victories of Gustavus Adolphus that sort of are the greatest stars in the firmament, right, of the Protestant achievements in a time in which confessional division, of course, was that important, right? By the time the English rose to imperial grandeur, that confessional had been somehow surpassed in a much more, let's say, modernistic, rationalistic, pragmaticistic, whatever you want to call it, way. It was not the time of the wars of religions, in spite of the fact that it's, yes, from the 18th century we started to reason in terms like religion is a problem, and of course these countries were sort of becoming more ahead in that process of secularization, etc. And so you understand how complex the matter really is. But the bulk, right, the essential concept that fundamentally the Dutch and the Swedish armies the Dutch between the end in the second half fundamentally of the 16th century, the beginning of the 17th, and the Swedish during the reign of Gustavus Adolphus in the first half of the 17th, achievements were sort of pumped historiographically in a way that came to overshadow what, at the time, likely, if you had asked the same protagonists of this, would have really surprised the contemporaries, meaning that, yes, these were effective armies that succeeded as such, as Clausewitzianly we know, the military being an instrument of politics, and so there is no doubt that the 80 Years' War was a Dutch victory, and the achievements of the Swedes, starting from Gustavus Adolphus, were really impressive. They opened to a greater phase of power of Swedish history. But this doesn't mean ipso facto that the actual armies that fought in that war were better or worse just because they respectively won or lost, right? It's like saying this is not there was much more symmetry at the time that, I don't know, the U.S. Army is inferior to the Taliban one because the U.S. pulled out of Afghanistan, right? This is not true. It's not true for Vietnam. This is not true for many other contexts when you have, of course, a much better military that, however, is not politically committed and or is actually defeated to an important degree, but still, when you look at the purely military side of the story, actually provides with a greater qualitative superiority, which is something, the latter aspect, that is not really considered. I'm a humble medievalist, as I often say and recall myself. But I've been around for a while. I've been reading lots of books on early modern warfare, and there is no doubt that aside from the specialistic publishing, there is not even a obvious hint at the fact that it could have been, in fact, the other way around. That still the Tercio and the other armies, essentially the ones of the empire, that fought along that model, were still guided in terms of tactical superiority, right? And that also, when we look at the same 80 Years' War, and the Swedish adventure in the 30 Years' one, and we contextualize them, we realize that, especially in the former case, which is the Dutch school that would have inspired Gustavus Adolphus, etc., is actually overrated to a dramatic degree, right? And again, don't get me wrong. If you cannot, I think highly, for example, of the Netherlands as a country historically, right? It's like the Swiss or other peoples that literally came out of nothing in many ways, but managed to become the most successful ones in the world, the richest ones, especially. When I, for example, have to tell you a military model that really kicked ass, it is the Dutch one, yes, but of 100 years later. The Dutch army at the end of the 17th, the beginning of the 18th century, that was, in the entire history of warfare, the best army in terms of cost-benefit ratio, right? Not a huge deal in tactical quality, just per se, but in the terms cost-benefits, in a truly financial sense. That where the Dutch had already began to, structure this model of management of, of care of the army, alongside, by the way, mercenary model, right? They weren't, the Dutch army was not Dutch, nationally speaking, at large, and also surviving in that context, as you know, to the actually much more impressive onslaught of the French to some degree. This is debatable, right, whether the Spanish one of the 80 Years' War was actually more impressive. Yes, it was very impressive, but in many ways there is also a lot to say about what was actually the Spanish policy towards the Netherlands, how they were faring there, and these are all topics that how worth the Netherlands really were, and what was happening within Spain. These are all topics that I've not even began to address in Schwerpunkt, because they are huge ones, don't get me wrong, but we must. But exactly because they're so important, they must be framed correctly, and I need more work and more time to prepare altogether the presentation in this. This video is actually not specifically about how actually the Dutch army was so successful just as a particular instrument of the United Provinces policy within that specific, not just political, but also strategic contexts. It's somehow more understandable to use, for example, smaller units, and think about the Dutch company's model in a country covered in canals, with marshes, in mostly siege warfare, where you can really, given the enormous pressure that the Dutch had over themselves, be more proactive and sort of eroding at every useful chance a much bigger army out there that, however, also required, in fact, an enormous cost to be sustained in the Netherlands. I will not be... I've been quite vocal, I think, about the Swedish army as well, the fact that most innovations that we attribute to Gustavus Adolphus wouldn't kick in the Swedish army, not just in his times, but even before 2 generations, right? What today I want to talk about specifically is an organic issue. It's one of these myths that have to do with the broader narrative of this period, essentially the second half of the 16th, the first one of the 17th century, which goes along, armies began to be smaller and to use smaller units, especially because of a positive tactical, doctrinal choice, right, in terms of pike and shot mechanics, right? This is a very interesting and controversial topic as well, because it entails, per se, that look what the Dutch and the Swedes were doing. They were actually developing such models. But they don't explain you why, right? Or at least, I explained why in my videos, so I give it for, settled why they were doing that. And especially in the Swedish case, there is no doubt that that there was a greater effectiveness, that the Swedish tactics were path opening, right? But if you look at the Swedish brigade, for example, that was a bulkier, more compact, bigger system than the Dutch one, for example. And so this trend towards the smaller units, the reduction of organics, is actually not true in a doctrinal sense, in a tactical sense, especially for the strongest armies. In a purely strategical sense, the bigger the army, the more effort you have to make it to work with combined arms, and so effectively, right? So if you are in the situation in which, you can have a smaller army because of resources, etc., but say with a bit more quality, right, and betting on that rather than the other, you're basically actually taking somewhere from somewhere that also, however, you have to give back in another way, and so you can balance the system out depending on what country, what what government, what military you're fundamentally handling. And so when you look at the Dutch and the Swedes, you understand why they were fighting that way. The attention is focused on them, but hardly on the Spanish and on the Catholic Germans, right? On the Imperials, let's say better. And the issue is, in a sort of positivistic and deterministic interpretation, during the first half of the 17th century, the regiments were getting smaller, right? And not just this, let's say, also in the second half of the 16th century, as we were saying now. The reduction of the dimension of the infantry units starting from the 60s, let's say, of the 16th century would have been, according to some at least, precise tactical choice. Right. Now, some of the authors that were expressing these ideas in such a convinced way are outdated, but it is true that they left an important mark historiographically. I mean, the few times I had for example, I attended one of Parker's lessons, right, a couple of years ago, and you realize that in that early modern warfare environment, historiographically, aside from the fact that they skip completely, say, probably an awareness of medieval armies and the peak that they achieved in the early 14th, that they completely ignored that, right? At least they only look at the infantry armies. They don't look at much bigger systems, in fact. I sort of had the same complaint for my era of specialization, but what you realize that really scares the hell out of you is how still, basically, the entire research is within the forced channel of the military revolution. How you can't basically write anything if you don't start from what the worldview of this military revolution, of course, never existed, and that especially, you know, it is ridiculous. I mean, if you think that the military revolution occurred from, say, mostly during the 16th, say the second half of the 15th, the second half of the 17th century, what does happen? What in the second half of the 17th, which was much bigger, scholarly impressive, but never hear military revolution for actual later times, right? You hear about the French Revolution that brought revolutionary armies, but not even in that case, which was actually the birth of mass armies, you hear this fireworks sort of terminology, phraseology of the military revolution, how everything changed, was about firepower increasing, technology that made that, and all this stuff, right? This is complete garbage. I say it here. You have my permission. You can't reference me in your... Of course, this is not, as I already explained here, far and wide. It's not really something you can use academically. At least you can, at your own risk and peril, right? Everybody, every author knows that you can't really seriously cite a YouTube video, even when it is actually a serious thing. But in confidential terms, yes, it is actually a major jerk-off that doesn't find... that I think makes it boring to study the otherwise incredibly interesting 16th and 17th century warfare. I have a true repulsion towards modernistic mindset. I mean, I better work with a contemporaneist than a modernist, right? At least the contemporaries are so naive that they don't even try, right? The modernists had to literally invent a whole new era which did not exist historically in order to find a job, and squeezing, the dummies as far as that is concerned. And even though, I laugh because, it is that funny and controversial in many ways, but it is a real thing. So today we will analyze specifically one factor of the story, the aforementioned regimental strength, right? And so the fact that, admittedly, I must avow that most of what you find written correctly, the emphasis that is placed correctly in the historiography of early modern warfare, is that, of course, the reduction of the organic was due to the chronic understrength of the armies because of major political, strategical, logistical reasons. So we perfectly know that the 30 Years' War was that messy and brutal and sort of shocked there is also something made up about that historiographically. But yes, the Germany turned out in a major brigand field, right, where you could loot, rape, destroy, whatever. There is beautiful literature about this. But it is also true that historiography sort of made it much worse than it even was, right? And don't get me wrong, it was terrifying. 1/3 of the German population was wiped out, or if not literally 1/3, but still, a shocking, traumatic dimension that is unspeakable of. Surely the 30 Years' War, as a broader political failure of the Habsburgs, of course, of taking over Germany, a settlement about the so-called post-Westphalian model, so the idea that every country would have what had already been issued in the various crises of the Holy Roman Empire, the cuius regio eius religio, that every state is sort of virtually independent in its own affairs, politically, confessionally, and militarily, because you have to defend the territory, the population. There are some broader agreements to spare the civilians, let's say, that are starting to be, in fact, the compaction of the state, and so the establishment of a permanent professional military, ever more distinguished from the fighters, which had not been the case up to that point. So, and of course, like the 80 Years' War, the Swedish accomplishments all did accelerate brutally towards that direction. Right, but still, do not confuse the political achievement necessarily with the military instrument. Those are, in many ways, also one the reflection of the other, but not in a directly proportional way, right? And warfare has its own logic. But the most important point of it all is twofold. The first one is that at the time, propaganda worked, and worked pretty damn well, right? The printing press was around from centuries. There was a major, extension of literature circulation, etc. There's a very interesting topic, for example, about a lot was written about war, but how many generals, how many commanders did actually read what we study as sources of that period, that war? That's something we were discussing the other day about the development of 18th century discipline, right? Even those generals that wrote in their memoirs some sort of military manuals what had to be done with this arm or the other, wouldn't necessarily actually use that or think of it in absolute rigid terms when they were commanding on the field, right? So for the 16th to the 17th century, things are even more complex and complicated for us to reconstruct. In many ways, we do not know what happened on the battlefields. We do, of course, but it takes a very diachronic and comparative amount of work and method in order to mature a pretty hardcore, accurate, and reliable way of, say, how it's as if you could feel the muscle of these armies, these military systems on the field when you read certain sources, when you try to reconstruct what happened on the field, right? So armies were actually not that different from one another. And when, especially, you look at the major engagements, you realize that the Pike square was necessary, mandatory, in that larger, bulkier form, right? And that firepower during this period did not even increase that much, nor it sparked that sense of that's the future. We have to just reform the entire system toward that direction because we invented technology. So because, I don't know, in the Protestant countries we study more science. Ask whether in Scotland or in Hungary, there was a particular, technological advancement, even though they were Calvinists. It all must be contextualized, and be aware that as I think showed pretty clearly in all the videos I made about the English Civil War armies, the Swedish ones, again, of Gustavus Adolphus, the ones of Maurice of Nassau, etc., I actually do see myself clearly a tendency towards, of course, the increasing power of the shot for for operational, tactical reasons from one side, political and strategical from another, which would open gradually that broader mechanism that was being actually experimented also from the Catholic side, and that, however, less people have concretely researched. Right? If you ask, what are the most famous, Spanish manuals of the 16th, of the 17th century, and you realize that it's not that they're difficult even to find, but that less people have actually researched them. And that actually when you find them, you realize that these manuals were much more about how to use larger units effectively on the field. And so all this need also to concentrate on smaller units, it's obviously dictated by the lesser means of smaller nations that were emerging at the time, that were doing so for much more pressing needs than, say, the Spanish were simply, trying to keep those countries for themselves. So this is a very important key of interpretation that deserves more relevance. The regimental strength is a measure to evaluate how much that previous model developed essentially within the Spanish army with the tercio and all. Made very few videos on the tercio, much more about the Protestants. I mean, also, fitting that sort of statistical trend, but, it's the cycle. If I have done something first, it's because, I likely will make less about it later, aside from specials and stuff like this one that try to focus on something more thought-provoking, right? So, it is really clear historiographically that the phenomenon of the constant diminution of the organic within the same Spanish tercios, for example, was evident throughout all the 80 Years' War, but also the wars against the French until the Treaty of the Pyrenees, the Peace of the Pyrenees in 1659. I also made a video about the native French infantry of the Italian wars that, as you know, was something sort of, less developed than, for example, the Swiss counterpart who was regularly hired by the French crown that did not like to arm large masses of men, especially in the very populous France, that if properly armed in that sense would have surely won the Italian wars, but that in its aristocratic reaction was to, again, careful about not causing the accidental creation, some angry veterans from the lower classes once come back home. The Swiss came back to Switzerland, even if they cost much, at least they were good at infantry, and the French noble houses were able to master pretty impressive, at least heavy cavalry and artillery. It still worked, by the way, in their own times. We're talking about Francis I's legions, four units of 6,000 men that were a disaster. They were barely employed. Eventually, they were just left as provincial regiments, basically, and between 1534 1558. Eventually, the French began to develop proper native infantry, but it took a while, the second half, in fact, of the 16th century. And especially this early units, as you understand, were inspired to the massive pike squares of the Swiss, of the Landsknechts. I made a video about both. By the way, if you're interested, we have to come back on them. We have talked almost nothing about the Italian wars. That's a pity, especially for these troops. We must recuperate on that. But essentially, in our second half of the 16th century, this several thousand strong squares were abandoned for smaller regiments of 1,500, 2,000 soldiers. Such reduction in the infantry unit size has to do with those broader practical problems of command and control that had already emerged, not just in the French army, during the Italian wars. In fact, moving orderly, several thousands of men concentrated, especially in this single units in essentially a few hundred square meters, was particularly difficult, especially for the higher officers that were, of course, responsible for the good outcome of the broader maneuvers. In fact, such concentration was preventing the latter almost entirely, right? We have to talk a bit more about the early squares, but in many ways, and as we know also for the Swiss, we will see somehow better now, albeit capable of advancing, of sort of steamrolling other infantry is still deployed in the older sort of medieval way, or not provided us with that collective training with the Pike that at the end of the day was in fact the deal, that required these larger numbers. Once you met with an enemy fighting in the same way, there wasn't much that you could really do, right? At that point, it's not sitting there, of course, maybe taking him on, of course, if you were the attacker, maneuvering some way, but fundamentally still trusting yourself to this dramatic attritional warfare that, seen from the outside, was still looking like a very static and de facto defensive system, right? There was cavalry around, there was a shot around. These Pike squares were so big that in many ways the attritioning obliged them to just sit there, having some effect support from these other units, and only very gradually managing to even approach one another, and at some point even withdrawing from the field without even the risk of being taken out from the enemy, because there wasn't that speed, right? These Pike squares had sort of killed even, as you know, the potential of cavalry to an important extent, especially by the mid 16th century, with the caracole, the reiter, that become sort of the most habitual cavalry tactics, which did not exclude, by the way, lancers, shock charges, even for the reiter themselves. These guys would throw even their pistols before charging, passing to cold steel. They would do that, but naturally, infantry dominated big times from quite a while. So there was, throughout all this period, indeed, an increase in firepower, which seemed the only way to surpass this impasse, right? And the reason why this was not a military revolution is that basically from the introduction of firearms to the in Western warfare to the development, full maturity of linear tactics, you have literally half of a millennium, right? From the 13th century to the 18th, right? And that tells you how slowly firepower, and so the technology behind that could unlock the situation. Of course, it was never the technology per se, but the capacity of a state of fielding forces that were not just the shot, right? But that when technology allowed you to invest more in this kind of firepower, you would invest into, however, channel this technology into a doctrine, into a tactic that required the technology to be like that rather than the other way around. So, hence, say, the need of thousands of soldiers armed with arquebuses, 16th century, also field cannons, that had the purpose of gradually cutting down as many pikemen as possible. That's how, say, for example, the initial Swiss model was knocked out of the battlefield at Marignano under artillery fire. The Swiss had basically developed a merely infantry-based system. For their own fortune, they were knocked out there because the fortune of Switzerland actually was the defeat of Marignano as a broader success of a country, we were saying before. And as we have observed, until the shot can't take out the pike, that cannot advance even under fire without being destroyed by missile, you can't have linear tactics as you start having at the beginning of the 18th century. Speaking of the Swiss, between the 15th and the 16th century, I talked a bit about that. We introduced the Swiss warfare. More or less what we're talking about. This was the model from which the Landsknechts were inspired from the same French legions that we described now were equipped. Also, in the actual variety of infantry types, right, there were men armed of Langspieß, which was essentially a roughly 6 meters long pole arm. Other soldiers were equipped with halberds or Zweihände, this massive double-handed swords that were destined in this sort of greater flexibility compared to the pikemen to protect especially the flanks of the square, because the Swiss were, again, they had finally surpassed the impasse, like this game of words, of medieval infantry that did advance but had not had at that point the capacity of steamrolling cavalry, and that for the first time, given this bulky, motivated, nation-based, large square pikes, enough collectively trained to maintain the front during the advance now, could in fact only just advance in a way. And there was some other tactical role, including with the double-handed swords meant to open certain gaps within also the pike ranks of the enemy, disordering that. We can talk about apologically how this worked in some other video. There were admittedly some missiles in the Swiss army, some also the bows. I made a video about a couple of months ago about the persistence of the longbow, the crossbow, in early modern armies. Arquebuses were out there. The Swiss actually had very poor armament as such. The country is notoriously devoid of metals, whatever, but it's the strength of their squares, of their bunch, right, that really had made them obtain this success. Soon, however, the other European countries that were sort of also more affluent than Switzerland, when you look at Spain, the Empire, even the French, they began to, of course, develop more tactically developed models. Say, within the 20s of the 16th century, the square, in fact, the Swiss square model enters a crisis, right? Fire, handguns, let's say, artillery systems, especially the model put together by the greatest commander in modern warfare, do you know who is? Gonzalo de Cordoba, the Gran Capitan, right? That's also a thing in pop culture. If you ask which the greatest commander in early modern warfare, he is the guy who invented early modern warfare. At the Battle of Cerignola in southern Italy, the Spanish basically use for the first time in a concertedly effective way the pike and shot. They managed to stop French cavalry charge. Admittedly, it was a ditch or whatever, but still, right? That's the beginning of what we call the pike and shot. Before this, we still see fundamentally medieval armies, right? In spite of the Swiss, again, having brought on the fore this quite sort of futuristic model, because they had a strong national cohesion, but not much, of a social articulation or to afford even that level of also technological hardware that was important for this other country. I mean, the French had massive artillery parks. Again, the logistical capacities of other countries were enormous compared to Switzerland. That, in fact, after Marignano sort of comes back within its own boundaries. I made a video about the history of the Swiss army, right, until pretty late. So the sense is that the idea of which the pike alone could take out the enemy formation was over. because the other states, the other countries had began to use the same model, and so you didn't have that asymmetrical advantage anymore, right? We can talk at some point about the combat effectiveness of the Swiss squares, but we'll leave it perhaps for another video. It's especially the Spanish, notoriously, with their tercio, that knew how to make of their arquebusiers' firepower the best used to put an end to the square based on the Swiss system, at least the abandonment of the halberd in favor of the more effective matchlock arquebus. This is relevant because, as we will see also in other videos, firepower was, let's say, was not so resolutive as with it wasn't even until the 18th century. And at the beginning it was very meager. Still, some countries like England went on with their longbows rather than the shot, and so there was a sort of mold to break to some extent. Think about the Chevalier Bayard, right, and other. I made some videos about that topic, like the end of chivalry, the age of firearms, killing the knight, etc. Admittedly, of course, every weapon, if profitably integrable within an adequate doctrine, with all a backbone, an induct of some sort, would have been used. We have seen it in very conservative anti-foot armed peoples and cultures, including the steppes one. At this point, firearms begin to be effective, especially in a collective fashion. Individually were not that much, they were actually ridiculous. But given this staticization of field engagements because of this bulky, almost unmovable, or at least counter-matched by other, the equivalent Pike squares, this combined arms system was sort of the future in itself. The Swiss had basically used just one arm, in spite of this internal, in fact, only infantry specialties. So at that point in history, with the Spanish model, you have the regiment commanders trying, as soon as possible, to increase the firepower of their units, right? And of course, they realized, as we explained before, that there was a limit for the number of men, especially, that could be equipped with firearms, in terms of not just of cost, but ideally, in the best case scenario, also in terms of space, because surpassing a concentration of certain concentration of shot could be as dangerous and problematic, just like it had happened for the pikemen. In fact, surpassing this limit would have blocked the soldiers' movements, would have rendered them sort of clumsy in the incredibly, as you know, complicated loading phase. Keeping these guys close to one another for a long time came to be literally risky. The bandoliers could catch fire, say, because just of the if you had the soldiers shooting too close to one another, with the consequence not just of the guy wearing the bandolier ignited, literally exploding, but causing a sort of domino effect all across the line if this had been too close. So the early order of the arquebuses was notoriously very open to allow this distance and not creating particular problems. So in order to, and so of course the firearm technology was limited at that time as well. In order to increase firepower, you needed again this greater space, as we explained, but at the same time you couldn't really overstretch them, because this would have become too vulnerable to the cavalry charges, and they would have found themselves too far away from the protection that the pikemen companies represented. In fact, at the beginning of pike and shot warfare, this bulky Pike Square, of course, had some advantages too, and the arquebusiers literally stationed around it as if this was a sort of fortress, right? Already at the time, there were debates on how to geometrically arrange this pike and shot combination. I mean, it was really the puzzle of all 16th, 17th century commanders until linear tactics, until musketry fire became so effective that could simply, if you have the means statally to equip actually the large amounts of troops that had to be, as we've seen the other day, drilled to maintain a line, right, which is much more complicated than a column to do it. That's why the early Swiss, you see from the passage from the pike to the shot, how much actual collective training increases, right? You must, not just armies are much larger, but they fight in line, right? And as such, they have much tougher time when advancing in maintaining formation, whereas with a pike block, yes, you do need an unprecedented level of collective training for the foot, but still it's a column, basically. And so it's relatively easy to just go, as the Swiss, even in some of the most glamorous victories, would achieve, just like literally risking to be cut out of all the rest, cut off from all the rest of the army, if they had any, endangering themselves, losing any escape route, but just surprising. The bet was surprising the enemy, that infantry could not advance so speedily. So it was not a magic winner system. Not just at the end it was beaten, but there was always a major risk involved, as every battle has, right? But in this sense, the Swiss were very morally loaded to not just risk so boldly, but also to win so well in their early days, and to change European warfare to that degree. As we're just saying, the doctrinal issue was finding a functional compromise between firepower, shock force, and numerical quantity, right? And so the actual space for deploying it in a particular way. The regiments made up of roughly 3,000 men were soon replaced by units, the strength of which was of the aforementioned 1,500, 2,000 effectives, and the dimensions of which seem to be, for this time in history, like the best ones, for the just proportion in here, not much between the pike and the shot, which was still an internal issue, but the defense and the attack, broadly meant. So this is not to deny that throughout the 16th and say this, even just this phase we covered today, the second half of the 16th, the beginning in the first half of the 17th century, there wouldn't be changes, and that firepower would not increase. But there is also a question of how did this happen? I mean, it couldn't be just a linear increase, or even so, it could not just be increasing constantly, right? And we see, especially in this period, a sort of stasis in which the major powers out there, the Spanish and the French mainly, had adapted their units on these new bases already within the end of the 16th century. So this was essentially the next step of homogenization in the second half of the 16th, right? Surpassing eventually the unique big Pike Square that, as we will see, that they were scattered in different arrays on the battlefield, right? As sort of, again, interdependent fortresses in the midst of which the shot and the cavalry ran around. Things, of course, would come to remodel themselves on smaller units that, as you understand here, are, at least at the regimental level, were diminished of 1/2, 1/3. And that historically will keep going down, but not for, again, strictly military reasons, right? This is the important sense of the story. Say, doctrinally, there was an idea of how this had to be, and more or less, right, armies operating in a normal context maintained this unit size, right? The standard, if you want, it's not a good way of describing it because warfare is always sort of asymmetrical, but conventional warfare was about this regimental strict. So when we will have to talk about Maurice of Nassau's armies here, because there is no proof during the 80 Years' War of, in this qualitative sense, one-to-one, of the tactical superiority of the Dutch armies. There isn't. On the contrary, when you look at those engagements in open field, where these forces had to be mustered, the Dutch model revealed itself to be inferior towards Spanish infantry that still maintained the highest standards in Europe. Right, the nucleus of veteran soldiers knew how to maneuver and adapt to the various tactical situations, and the Dutch were essentially trying to avoid, in fact, this open confrontations, mostly making very good use of terrain, trying to avoid that, to gap that asymmetry and their inferiority fundamentally. So when we look at that sort of fragmentation of forces, the reduction in the size of the units, aside from all the various political, strategical, and social issues that had brought them to be fielded in that way, because they may have been just the only one they had and the only one they could train at that level. I mean, having smaller units doesn't actually mean ipso facto having them operate more effectively, right? You need a degree of collective training, not necessarily they have, and the Spanish were playing the bigger game. They knew how to do that better with bigger units. That's why in a difficult terrain such as the Netherlands, they had sort of more difficulty as such, even though they managed to adapt pretty well even for those circumstances. In the French army, such organic was institutionalized with the creation of the bataillon, so the battalion, that essentially broke the regimental unit, making it become the basic tactical one for the campaign operations, and it essentially granted those proportions that we've seen were necessary between mobility, firepower, and shock force. So when you look at the 17th century battlefield, you realize that it's not just about having smaller units that can interact more intensely between one another. There is an entire army that has to operate in the same way, right? So again, you can try to invest on this smaller scale unit tactical combined arms interaction, right? With, in order to wear out a section of the enemy. But the enemy, in that sense, if he can operate, still has the tactical standards to operate with larger units, in basically the same way, can counter you in a conventional sense, because it's just stronger in many ways. You cannot take that out of the equation. Nor you can actually look at the soldiers, say, of the Dutch and the Swedes, simply saying, well, these were actual professionals, as if, the other guys from the other side weren't, right? It is true that there is a moral dimension there that, as we explained, had a lot to do with the motivation, the reasons why those guys were fighting against the empire. It is true that the Catholic forces were, exactly because of playing a bigger game, sort of diluting even the quality of their troops to some extent. The 30 Years' War is especially evident in that case. With the 80 Years' one, it not so much, right? It was more unity. In other words, the Spanish standards were higher than the one of the Catholic Germans. But still, the latter had the upper hand in Germany. I mean, the majority of Protestant armies in Germany that were inspiring themselves to the Dutch and the Swedes were actually notoriously not as good as the Southern German one, the Catholic German ones, and the strategic principle behind that was the same, right? If you invest in the at least excessive fragmentation of your army, because you have even more difficulties to field one, for example, in the first place, you will suffer serious defeats, as it happened, in fact, in the Protestant German forces who suffered an impressive series of debacle up to all the 30s of the 17th century. And that's also sort of self-evident. Again, Sweden was a different thing. Sweden was a bulkier system. It was well financed by the French. It was sort of ramping up in a historical sense at that point, and such a great commander like Gustavus Adolphus was able to seize that opportunity, and his genius, his vision, managed to score the victories that the Swedish army really did. But also, the Swedish army of Gustavus Adolphus, that had been inspired and trained inspired by and trained by the essentially Dutch military doctrine, had to change his mind regarding this excessive fractioning of the Dutch companies that we're finding again in a very different context from the one of the open grounds of Germany, in order to favor especially the mobility of the units in this open grounds. In fact, the King of Sweden was, during his German exploit, obliged to group the smaller squadrons to form the bigger, in fact more famous unit, the brigade. Right? And there's no doubt there was a lot of tactical insight in that to explain how the Swedish brigade worked. But if, in that sense, the idea historiographically is that the Dutch had been ahead because they had smaller units and interacted with one another when they actually didn't even face major challenges in open ground like the Protestants in Germany would, right? Let's remember, this is the Dutch are basically only the first ones to secede from the empire in the process later on. The smaller units just per se are sort of weaker. You need something like the larger Swedish brigade in order to be more effective, right? Again, this is so obvious both at a tactical and a strategic level. When you look at great empires falling, we've seen it many times in history, at the fall of the Roman Empire, of the Carolingian Empire. What do you have from the other side? You do not actually have more updated military systems. Not at all. You hardly have systems that are able to match the armies of these major powers in open ground. There is a weaker model that succeeds because of the internal issues of the giant, like this the Habsburgic Germany could be, or the Spanish Empire. In peripheral contexts as well, they were also more difficult to find in for the same troops. Considered all the ravaging of the 30 Years' War, we've seen how states like Brandenburg or Saxony were still essentially relying on feudal military organization, whereas even the Habsburgs, that were not swimming in gold really, but had managed to create like some sounder military, and were capable of sustaining it to a greater degree. So when operating, of course, in northern Germany, there were also less resources, and that's an important aspect to take in consideration, as well as the international cooperation. Again, if the Swedes had not had the French money, they could have hardly carried out what Gustavus Adolphus did in Germany, right? So, to make the long story short, within by the 30s, let's say, of the 17th century, all the sort of acclaimed reforms of Maurice of Nassau and all the theories on the fractioning of the army's smaller units, combat units, had been debunked, right? This is a bit like, there is an interesting comparison with sort of the contemporary ignorance in the understanding of military history. There is the vexata quaestio that is actually not really that of an issue of the, because of Total War games, everybody is, an historical expert about the Macedonian phalanx and the Roman legion, right? And so why did the Romans win against the Macedonian phalanx? Because they're more flexible, they had smaller units, and they could insert themselves into the gaps of the final. Complete BS, by the way. That's a bit the same concept, right? Why were these armies successful? Because you see, Maurice of Nassau was this genius that invented that, he understood that with smaller units, they could beat the bigger ones. It doesn't mean anything, right? In warfare, if you have smaller units, it's because you can't handle the bigger ones. It's not something to be celebrated. It's not something to be found as, more relevant as such. The smaller you are, the weaker you are, right? You can't be concentrating larger amount of forces to sort of interact with one another, let's say, in a more flexible way if you are more collectively trained. But being more collectively trained in strategy, where literally the thing you must do is being the strongest, von Clausewitz says. Karl von Clausewitz literally said this. The best strategy is to be as strong as you can. He literally says that, and most people, if you don't say that von Clausewitz said that, would say, this is just a noob, doesn't understand the strategical principles. We all are. Essentially, the modern mindset fascinates itself with the idea that the more complicated a system is, the more effective it is. This is, especially in the military, is notoriously BS, right? It is true that bigger forces may be clumsier in certain contexts than smaller ones, right? And it's better, having less troops at some point than not. Of course, there are certain circumstances, but if you are able to hit the enemy with larger forces, and in open field, that's essentially what you have to do. The most effective thing that you can do is having bigger units that you can sort of simply use to, say, block the enemy, outflanking it, for example. Having these multiple lines, whatever, to use maybe a gradual fort with the reserves, whatever, but fundamentally still in big blocks, in strong ones, right? And of course, if the enemy finds a way to channel you somewhere, to put you in a condition of inferiority, all good. But this does not necessarily come through smaller units, nor actually on average it does. Right, on average, if you can operate bigger units that can deliver that bigger punch to the enemy, if there are not other factors around, as they can always emerge, and they did during these wars, evidently, you still, will beat the hell out of this guy, right? And again, the 30 Years' War in itself actually does show this as well. Saying that the Swedes were the best troops out there is true during the 30 Years' War, but the 30 Years' War was not just the Swedish army of Gustavus Adolphus, and the Catholic forces did score remarkable victories throughout all the period that were not enough to achieve what they politically wanted. Also, if you think about it, the Protestants did, but still halfway after all. And so, yes, you can measure the swings and what these wars politically... We're talking politics here, right? But militarily speaking, there is no actual evidence that smaller forces at parity of training were actually better than the bigger ones, right? There is a classical principle of the art of war, which is simplicity. Keep it simple. Having smaller units and having to make them coordinate with one another is not actually the simplest way, right? Even if you think about how linear tactics would eventually develop, it's not that the lines were just all, the various regiments were sort of interacting with one another, meaning that they were breaking the line to carry out flank attacks, whatever. No, the core principle is you must have this line that has to punch the enemy frontally. And if the line is broken, it's actually a big deal. You have still, however, to continue go on frontally, and there is really no other diversion out of this. That's it. Even when you look at the so-called oblique order of Frederick the Great, it's still a line that advances just at a different angle compared to the enemy one, attacking from the flank de facto, but still in a line. And so at that point, catching the enemy by surprise and investing in that sense in the collective training of the army as far as the nobility of the whole army was, not the individual chunks of it. So again, this breaking down of forces, the fact especially that this shrinking of the units would actually provide with a positive solution to tactical problems is BS, right? And don't get me wrong, historically, the organics kept diminishing, right? But the reasons of this diminution are very Clausewitzian in this sense. They were not of tactical order, of a military one stricto sensu. They actually reflected the political limits, right? The financial costs, the bureaucratic issues, the logistical problems of the governments in maintaining a fully supplied organic in the units, right? This did mean that, of course, if you do not invest in this, you are also providing with smaller troops. In fact, you're going to be weaker, right? And so you understand how this levels things. But if ex absurdo this war had stopped and the contenders could resupply, they would have actually fielded larger units. They would have still kept fighting essentially with that large organic and still fundamentally based on the Pike square next to the shot, but to an important degree. It's like, I don't know, what you've seen in Ukraine, for example, that the Soviet doctrine that basically Russia still follows contemplate certain units that now on the field in that particular theater cannot hold, right? And they broke down, they reduced to incredibly simpler tactics. Then eventually they began to copy a bit the Ukrainian ones that were more effective. But it's not that they literally changed their doctrine, meaning that if they had a fully resupplied army, they would abandon their previous level of organic, right? The point is, of course, that history is eventually real armies are going to be these ones as opposed to the ones that you would have by doctrine. But it is also true that there is not just a 30 years war in Europe while this stuff was happening. So in other contexts, in spite of all the problems that were surely not brushed away if you fought outside of Germany just per se, but surely that were increased there by the, again, sort of no man's land, right? Cities sacked just in order to supply the armies, because there was not much of a way to do so. Think about the fierce sack of Antwerp back in during the 80 Years' War. Think about the Magdeburg one as well. So all events that if you can easily condemn, but if you actually look at the contingency, aside from the fact that the troops were about to mutiny if they had not been allowed sacking, but still were in many ways the ruthless, colder, but more rational choice as well, that still made it sort of viable, that made it positive outcome in a contingent sense, right? There were other, for example, the French army suffered enormously of this organic understrength. Right, around 1635, the infantry companies nominally strong of 100 men each hardly would reach 60 men. Those regiments, the French regiments, found themselves thus to be composed of not more than 500, 650 soldiers, whereas so this would actually be the originary force of a battalion, right? So you understand they had fallen to something like essentially 1/3 of what a regiment had to be. There's a beautiful source, from the Chronicle of Monferrato, that tells us that those French regiments that had been used in the defense of the citadel of Casale Monferrato were made up of few soldiers, because the best regiment would not surpass 150 men. Right, so in that case, well, it's a frontier context, but still, it does tell you how scarce this strength could be, right? And so, let's not digress on the on the extreme variety of strategic theaters and how troops were put together at the time. I made a video about Louis XIV's army that sort of explains how, in fact, this system was surpassed in a few decades, exactly because of these enormous problems that had appeared. Right, but I think it's sort of sensible to conclude that during the 17th century wars, armies would change the battalions and the regiments on the basis of the matured experience, the experience matured on the battlefield and the tactical needs, right? The tercios, for example, have this arc, right? From the 17th century they begin sort of decline. Rockford at least is intended as that, even though the system went on also during the later century. But the tercio, while remaining an administrative term, would have changed on the battlefield. It would have essentially been made up of one of two escuadrones of the same tercio. That is to say, the equivalent, practically, of the French battalion, as we've seen, half, right, of the, or even 1/3 of the same force, depending on, how these were, right? And even if the escadron was had become this sort of fixed element, thus a bit like the battalion, this was formed from time to time. So the proportion of pike and shot that made it up could vary as well, and it could adapt in this way both to the terrain, the presence of obstacles of passive defenses such as trenches, or the same enemy tactics. It's actually not a very different reason from which the same Swedes, for example, abandoned in a figurative way the pike during, for example, their atrocious marches in Germany, because it was very difficult to bear this pike, and there were lots of smaller engagements that required more flexibility and more shot engagements. The same goes for the English infantry during the Civil War, with all those edges and smaller combats in the English countryside. The shot became sort of more relevant, but not because the pike would have not kept being used, right, in larger engagements that were obviously less frequent, but could still happen. So the actual end of the, let's say, when you look at these factors, you realize that, especially this sense that there was allegedly a doctrinal divide between the Protestants and the Catholics in this sense, it sort of doesn't make sense. Basically what happened is that the Catholics at the beginning of the period have the upper hand. They have the best armies, the best quality. Right then, politically, these northern Protestant nations make it to emancipate themselves, to grow, to rise, and to essentially defeat, in at least on multiple occasions, and in different theaters, the Catholic forces. Because they're strengthening themselves, the Catholics are strengthening as well, but within less of a universal dimension. Like, they become sort of all different regional powers, but with their own spheres of influence, as much as you see basically still in the map of Europe today. Much of that was sort of started to take shape, of course, at this time. It was also a bit before, depending on what you want to look. And essentially the Protestants began to, we will see this better in another video, to claim that their victory, like their military victories meant in the war, like so political accomplishment, would have been due to an alleged tactical, say better, doctrinal innovation or superiority. And this idea was repeated in the following generations, especially, not much in the contemporary ones, to the point that eventually the countries that sort of made it ahead, like in fact we're talking about England, the United Provinces, etc., that became the most advanced countries in Europe, began sort of to dominate also culturally, the historiography. They think about the impact in the Anglosphere, etc. And so the idea that there would have been some sort of broader Protestant accomplishment in a doctrinal sense has come to be credited as, look, we won the war, so we had simply the best doctrine in a tactical sense. This is actually not correct, right? It was more or less the same doctrine that the others had. We know that the Spanish were toying with similar concepts that today we didn't enter in the specifics of how to make also the smaller units interact on the battlefield. But they were doing so out of practical necessity, and in parallel, sometimes even before, actually. When you look even at the Dutch, in the same years of Maurice and Nassau, the Spanish were actually toying with that sort of attempt of, fluidification and base of more interaction with the smaller units, the increase of the shot, just like their enemies were doing, right? The circumstances, especially Sweden, is the most unequivocal moral superiority, but there is also to say that after Gustavus Adolphus, the system as such did not literally just remain standing. It's something that happened in other times in history. Like if you pick, for example, the cohorts of Scipio Africanus, right, during the Second Punic War, you would think that the Romans, basically after that, they had, since Polybius says that, I'm not going to digress on the semi and all this stuff, but the spari, etc. But the idea is that the Romans had cohorts since then, right? Many people think that because they played Roman Total War that they had cohorts just after Marius. This is actual BS, right? There already were certain units. But actually we do not have a documented evidence that these units were there, or that they played any relevant tactical role, given that Rome also didn't fight major battles at the time. It was mostly on the defensive in the following generations, in which the cohort was there, in which the maniples essentially had enough collective training to be used as a cohort in specific maneuvers that we have any proof of, right? We have this cohorts seemingly pioneered by a hell of a general during a hell of a campaign, like, you know, the one of Scipio Africanus in Spain and in Africa. But after that, what about the Roman army? Was it reformed according to what Scipio had done in those campaigns? No, there is no evidence about that. There is just evidence that armies came to be in a certain way, and later on, gradually on their own, so that Marius did just formalize a de facto already existing situation. And we should be training ourselves to see this also in this period, second half of the 16th, first half of the 17th century, because even though there is no doubt that Protestant nations were getting sort of a moral upper hand, and you can even talk about a greater individual quality, still they were not as absolutely strong. Their forces were stronger than their enemies. That's what it means. It's a bit like, I don't know, Prussia during the 7 Years' War. Prussia was not stronger than Austria or France or Russia, but it had the best troops, right? And still it risked to be wiped out thrice from the map of Europe. So you can't avoid to see the greatness, especially Frederick the Great, in that context and so on, where, again, like Gustavus Adolphus, etc., we have some of the greatest names there in terms of military accomplishments and fluidification of the system. It's just like you can see Prince Eugene or other, I don't know, even imperial, very, very capable and good imperial commanders of the 30 Years' War. But in fact, as part of a system that is broadly European, that doesn't quite display, especially the certified reality that there would have been on the battlefields of the 80 or the 30 Years' War, such major doctrinal divides. As we've seen actually in the Swedish case, great part of the success was the increase in organic strength. And even the increase actually of the pike compared to the previous Swedish way of war, because up to Gustavus Adolphus apparently the Swedes had not managed even to have decent pikemen units in their cohesion. So it was a disaster. We'll talk about the early Vasa's armies, but they had other qualities, right? And so as von Clausewitz teaches, war is about moral force. These were very bulky, rudimentary, and sort of warlike systems that were adjusting against one another in terms of political territorial control. They had to boost their military capacities. They had to provide enough manpower to just sometimes hold one place rather than thinking about ideal tactical sophistications. But whenever they could fight, they would, in open ground with larger forces, of course they would go for something that until the mid-17th century had fundamentally remained based on the older Pike square, at least not the very old one as we've seen, but the one that had come by existence in the second half of the 16th century with this regimental strength of 1,500, 2,000 men, and that aside the internal issues of Pike and shot, was essentially the same force, and thus had to fight basically in the same ways their enemies do, right? But I will talk more profusely about this. We will talk about what, again, we study on, what kind of sources we study on to reconstruct what armies actually were during these campaigns, these battles, and what did these commanders also get interested in on the road. I mean, did they really care about, for example, this Dutch or Swedish tactical intuitions in a concrete sense, even as Protestants? Right, in part, yes, we do know that, but who exactly was doing this? The commander specifically, that normally was not a man of letter just per se, or was it just, again, a later historiographical trope? Was it just a contingential necessity? Was it that, again, there was a propaganda of the time celebrating the accomplishments of the fellow Protestants, so they needed to boost it further? These are all questions that one must take in consideration, because it seems that, again, from an organic point of view and a doctrinal one as well, not much really differed between these various systems, right? We, of course, appreciate the innovation, we appreciate the path openers, we appreciate especially the military victories, right? But in this sense, we don't have to think that even some older systems were just wars per se. Just think about the Polish hussars, an anachronism of success, essentially a medieval knight in the 17th century that would, if the enemy was properly softened up, charge even into the western pikes, because their own lances were longer even. Naturally, that was not the preferable option, but they succeeded also in that. So what does it mean? That since that was an old concept, it would not work, right? Gustavus Adolphus is the guy that also, because of that Polish nightmarish experience, resumes cold steel for cavalry, right? To an important degree. It's true that cavalry had been coming back already from the beginning of the century as well, but you want to integrate that further because of your tactical operational needs, that, remember, are not quite the same. Like you can have different contingencies in different, even in the same war, different armies because of different strategies, and not, just a mere, equality to other theoretical standards, or the ones of the enemy, for sure. But in essence, warfare did not change to that radical degree for which we can especially look at the organic reduction as a fully doctrinal accomplishment. And it is true also that so much changes in terms of pike and shot throughout these times that organic per se is not even just the only problem. It's also about what do you do with these troops, and why do you firepower was increasing. Indeed, it was actually pretty limited still. In fact, up to this mid-17th century, you will see there are some passages from, I don't know, the diaries of the Swedish lieutenant at the Battle of Lutzen that tell us that basically in order to engage the enemy in a successful way. Now, this is actually Bridenfeld, they had to come at pistol range, 25 meters, unloading their volleys, their musketry volleys, and then charging in. And literally the battle began like that. 25 meters of distance. Indeed, if you even look at, other periods like, the American Civil War. Yes, technology, whatever, but engagements were still an incredibly primitive thing. Right? The idea of the distance from the enemies is something that especially post-Vietnam War culturalistic and technologistic historiography became phobic of. Right? The idea that you had always to be distant from the enemy, that even the geopolitical battles were something about all compact together without trying to come out and being scared almost of melee and just try to maximize just the mass without having to shed blood with any other. That's not how the mindset of those people really were. Right? And so today's video is just like a beginning, like more an introduction to the doubts, right? To the sort of the legitimate, let's say, refinements, sort of issues, the interpretative difficulties, and so on. But as we will see, especially the Dutch model was something particularly effective within the Netherlands, but it would have not sustained, as again the Protestant German failures actually did show clamorously enough. Broader, sort of more open field confrontation against the Catholic forces, based essentially on the Spanish models from the imperial side. So this is incredibly important, and I can't stress enough how strategically refined one must be in order to sort of quantitatively appreciate like these dimensions, because it's very difficult, right? And I have difficulties myself sometimes, because again, what are the bases we're discussing here? When we look at certain battles and we look at certain, I actually don't have much of a problem in thinking that the firepower was a big deal, but indeed there was something more happening, right? Collective training is not a joke, right? And it is what makes the best. If you look at the video about the Battle of Freyberg, the actual like the stubbornness, the ultimate effectiveness of the French infantry against the Habsburgic fortifications was insane, insanely marvelous in itself. These guys could lose a half of their effectiveness just to storm day after day the enemy positions, and even maintaining a unit cohesion for fighting another day, and just going for it, right? Even in a very assault, again, this is not much about pike warfare, right? It is also mostly about actual cold steel assault, right? The enemy fortifications. It's really impressive. That tells you how, for example, a military like the one of France, despite needing reform, etc., was still still had a hell of a military culture. In fact, that it would have developed further. Whereas you see this German context having instead still a bit of difficulty taking off as a true modern one. Still, the militias there play a crucial role with all the limitations of the case, and there is a difficulty in especially agglutinating the various elements of within Germany in order to field an actual stattal army. This means a lot, right? It means a lot as far as we were saying before. Just the Dutch, for example, being a nation, surely had, and emerging as such at the time, were more motivated, had a greater reason to fight for their cause than, many German levies during the 30 Years' War. And so you can't take this out of the equation when you look at this alleged tactical innovations that rather came to be just because the situation required it, not because somebody really studied this hard at a desk and decided that the next day, the army had to fight in another way. Right? Especially in this time, it's very far from happening. Right? Even if there is a greater theoretical insight and there are questions posed and treatises written, but that is yet not what happened on the battlefields. That is largely undocumented, at least to the degree that we would like to appreciate, right? And unfortunately, we have to be humble enough to recognize it, right? So, but the 30 years warfare is still all to discover, in my opinion, right? If you want to be very much about this, you should, I don't know, make a PhD. Even having the courage of reconstructing battles that have already been studied, right, and on their comparative basis, reflecting whether your experience suggests you that there could have been systemic misunderstanding about, for example, how a certain battle would, how a standard battle of the time would have been fought, right? There is no such thing like a standard battle, but if you have studied already in detail, reconstructed from the sources available, already the major battles of the 30 Years' War, I think you would have an idea, dimensionally, comparatively, of what had happened and why, right? In these decades that, in fact, you can't believe would have brought to such a radical alteration of warfare. In essence, for how it was at the time, right? They got modified, they got toughened, they got sort of put on a track. You see this decline of the Pike, this increase of the shot, but to some broader extent, if you realize that the most important issues happening are political, the military ones were just else, and there was enough capacity to fight also elsewhere, and there you would find also interesting differences with in theaters, etc. by the very same armies, the very same polities that were using certain tactics somewhere else. So I would actually consider this as a legitimate interest, and I hope that we will be covering more 30 Years' War battles soon to understand a bit better what I'm talking about, right? Because some displays are really impressive, especially in terms of infantry sturdiness, but not only, right? Also cavalry comes back, as we've seen, etc. But in terms of the Pike, the decisive arm here, you can't quite look at it and at times not being impressed by the level of collective training that in some powers, like even France, had been achieved, for example. That is not usually the power that you study for saying, well, this was so advanced at the time, as opposed to the Dutch or the Swedes. Right. So I'm really confident about this this thing to have a fertile ground for further insight. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.